Today we're going to dig into one of the most misread, misapplied portions of the Bible. One that's creating a lot of confusion in the world of Western Christianity right now, especially as our world keeps getting a little weirder. A lot of people in the ancient Middle East felt the sting of the Neo-Babylonian armies, but nobody felt it quite as keenly as the tribe of Judah. They'd been warned by godly prophets that the Babylonians were coming, but they had foolishly chosen to believe that because they were the covenant people of God and they had the temple right there in their midst, that nothing could possibly go wrong. After all, wasn't this God's sacred city? How in the world could anybody think that God would allow a group of profane Gentiles to conquer something as important, something as utterly pivotal as the very center of his religious system? The conquest of Jerusalem would signal that maybe the Babylonian gods were more powerful than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they refused to believe it. There was just one voice in the city that continued to sound the alarm, and that was the prophetic nuisance Jeremiah, who was the only person who still said the Babylonians were going to prevail. Every other religious authority, every other so-called prophet was pointing to the magnificent structure on the Temple Mount as proof positive that nothing bad could possibly happen. Do not trust in these lying words, Jeremiah warned them, saying, "The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these." The religious authorities of that day were treating the temple as some kind of good luck charm or talisman, figuring they could hide behind it during an emergency. But of course, up to that point, they had utterly refused to abide by the terms of the covenant. And now their desire to duck behind the temple was pointless because the presence of God, the one who told them to build that temple in the first place, well, he was no longer in their midst, and the stunning structure built by Solomon was now just another building. It was pointless. The way the Bible phrases it, God's patience with his wayward people had completely worn out, and according to 2 Kings 24, he finally cast them out from his presence. We find a record of what happened when the Babylonians pulled into town in the book of 2 Kings. This was not their first visit because they had been there before to take people captive. But now they really meant business because even though the Jewish king Zedekiah had pledged allegiance to Babylon, promising to be a faithful servant to them, he was clearly lying. He'd been busy trying to cobble together an allegiance with the Egyptians, hoping that by working together, they could finally rid themselves of their Babylonian overlords. So, in 588 BC, the Babylonians pulled up outside the walls of Jerusalem and began to lay siege. By 587, they had successfully taken the city, and they were not about to leave any possibility for further rebellion. The city walls were completely destroyed, and they burned the temple to the ground. Zedekiah, of course, fled to the countryside. But the Babylonians caught up with him and dealt him a humiliating blow. His sons were slaughtered right in front of him, and then he was blinded so that his boy's death was the very last thing he would ever see. He was chained up like a common slave and deported to Babylon. On the landscape of everything that happens in the Bible, the conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple serve as a major focal point. This is one of the big keys that helps you understand the rest of the Bible. The vast majority of what you read in the Old Testament covers a period of time from the creation of the world down to the Babylonian exile. There are portions that refer to what happened after the exile, like Ezra and Nehemiah, which are books that describe the restoration of Jerusalem, and we have a few other portions that take place after Nebuchadnezzar. But the bulk of this narrative takes us down to the destruction of Solomon's temple, where the dreams and aspirations of God's people are suddenly shattered. Of course, the tribe of Judah was not the only victim of Babylonian brutality. All of their neighbors had also felt the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar's armies. But for the Israelites, it was particularly humiliating. Their ancient father Abraham was a Chaldean who migrated to the Promised Land from the city of Ur. Abraham was promised that the entire region now known as the Holy Land would belong to his descendants, who would be as numberless as the grains of sand on a beach. Abraham's children were considered to be the bride of God, as the prophet Ezekiel explained after the Babylonian conquest. When I passed by you again and looked upon you, God tells his people through the prophet, indeed your time was the time of love. So I spread my wing over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore an oath to you and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine, says the Lord God. The relationship between God and Israel was a love story, quite literally born in heaven. But the bride, who originally hailed from Chaldea, proved to be unfaithful. So now she was being returned in shame to her family. The march back to Babylon was a national disgrace, a very public announcement that the nation of Israel was guilty of spiritual adultery and she was being sent back home. And tragically, it was not the only time the temple was left desolate. Roughly half a millennium later, another warning was sounded in the city of Jerusalem, this time by Jesus. One day, as he contemplated what had become of the faith of Abraham, he publicly mourned the fate of the temple and made a rather dire prediction found in Matthew chapter 23. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." Of course, this really bothered the disciples because it was a clear allusion to the Babylonian destruction of the temple, when the sins of God's people had become so egregious that the rituals at the temple became meaningless. The religion was just a matter of going through the motions. But now groups like the Pharisees were working overtime to make sure nobody even got close to sinning like the ancestors did. Jesus, however, was underwhelmed by the Pharisees' efforts and openly condemned the way they conducted themselves. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," he said, "for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." It was all very concerning to the disciples, who ironically began to make the same plea as the false prophets of Jeremiah's day. They appealed to the temple. Here's what it says in Matthew 24, right after Jesus predicted that the temple would be left desolate. "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" Of course, in hindsight, we all know that Jesus was completely right. A few years later, in AD 70, in the midst of a rebellion that the Romans wanted to squash, one soldier pushed a lit torch inside the temple and it lit the entire place on fire. The temple burned to the ground along with the zealots who were hiding inside, and when the flames finally died down, the Romans disassembled what was left, block by block, essentially creating the Temple Mount that you can still see to this day, which is nothing but a single wall where people come to pray. What's amazing about this national tragedy is the way that it was entirely predictable, and not just because Jesus announced it just a few years before it happened. The fate of the temple had actually been predicted during the Babylonian captivity, hundreds of years in the past. I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is still one of the world's most contentious spots. Today it's controlled by Muslims, and it features the Dome of the Rock, a magnificent shrine that marks the place where they believe is the spot where Muhammad began his miraculous night journey, which he said was a visit to heaven. Now, today there's a segment of Western Christianity that believes that in order for Christ to return, the Jews must reclaim the Temple Mount and build a third temple, which of course poses a bit of a problem because in order to do that, you'd have to compromise one of the holiest sites in Islam. The potential for an international incident is absolutely massive. All it would take to spark a major conflict is for one well-meaning zealot to do something, well, radical. Right now, as it stands, non-Muslims are not even allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, which is admittedly a hard thing to enforce, but the regulation is there. The Muslims are determined that this spot belongs to them. Now, just before the break, I said that the destruction of the Second Temple was actually predicted during the Babylonian captivity. And right now I'm going to demonstrate that. So you might want to grab a copy of the Bible and follow along, because we're going to look at a passage from the Old Testament that in recent times has been taken out of its context to make it say things it was never intended to say. I'm talking about Daniel chapter 9, which a lot of modern Western Christians assume is talking about a last day scenario in which the antichrist starts to make trouble for the entire planet. But that's a relatively modern understanding that would come as a surprise to roughly 1,800 years worth of Christians who didn't read it that way. Let me show you what I mean. At the beginning of Daniel chapter 9, we find the prophet asking God to help him understand the fate of God's people, who were living in Babylon. Jeremiah had predicted that the Babylonian captivity would last 70 years, and that time was drawing to a close. And that would mean that Daniel himself is now an old man, because he was among the people captured when the temple was sacked. So here's what it says, beginning right at the top of Daniel chapter 9. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now you see that word desolations? A lot of modern books about prophecy like to suggest that the, quote, abomination of desolation represents the work of some kind of latter-day dictator who openly opposes the Christian faith. And that understanding is partly understandable because the Bible kind of uses it in that sense when it uses the destruction of the temple as an illustration for what the church would go through in the future. But in its primary sense, the abomination of desolation is talking about the wickedness of human kings. At the very end of 2 Chronicles, it lists a number of very wicked people who committed what the Bible calls abominations. And it says that led directly to the Babylonians sacking the temple and leaving it desolate. In other words, it's not the sins of an outsider that this term is addressing. It's the sins of God's own people, which becomes obvious when you read the lament of Jesus over the city of Jerusalem. He's brokenhearted because his people had once again strayed from the purpose of the faith. And so now he tells them that once again their house was going to be left desolate. Then looking ahead to the dark moment when the Romans would begin their military crackdown, Jesus says this, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Read it really carefully and you'll see. Jesus is tying the future destruction of the temple to the prophecies of Daniel, which takes us again back to Daniel chapter 9. There's a brief prophetic passage at the end of this chapter that some people call the 70-week prophecy. And that's what I want to look at right now because, well, it doesn't say what a lot of people think it says. These are the words of the angel Gabriel, who's trying to help Daniel understand God's future plans for the nation of Israel. And it says this, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, there's a lot in that passage we need to unpack, so let's just start with the number 70, which is the number of years Jeremiah predicted for the Babylonian captivity. It represented 490 years of disobedience, and in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 21, we discover that in particular the nation had refused to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, which of course represents 1/7 of the time they were in rebellion. Here's what it says. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. So the land was quiet to make up for every single Sabbath that was missed. So what we have is 70 years of captivity that represent 490 years of apostasy. Now, as the nation is getting ready to go back to the promised land, God tells Daniel they're going to get another group of 70. 70 weeks to be exact. And of course, 70 weeks is actually 490 days. And that's really, really important. Christians have long understood that these 490 days represent 490 years, because it's so obvious that this is a parallel time span with the 70 years of captivity that represent 490 years of rebellion. It's using days to represent years, which, if you look through the Old Testament, is a very common prophetic motif. So what exactly does it mean? The people of God had been violating the covenant for 490 years, and now they were going to get another 490 years that served as a probationary period. This was a special time set aside for Daniel's people, it says, and Daniel's city. Daniel's people, of course, were the Jews. And Daniel's city was Jerusalem. So this is really pretty easy to decipher. The prophecy continues now in Daniel 9:25, and it starts to get a little technical, but stick with me for a few minutes because this really will be worth it. It says, "Know therefore and understand, that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince," and of course that would be Jesus, "there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall even in troublesome times." Now, this is why this passage captures the attention of so many Christians, because it makes specific reference to the appearance of Messiah, and it says that he would appear 7 weeks plus 62 weeks after the command to rebuild Jerusalem. And this is where the passage really defies a lot of skeptics, because it works out to be precisely right. Even though a number of Persian royals indicated their support for the return of God's people, it was in 537 BC that we get this specific command from Artaxerxes that not only commands the work to be done, but it actually provided resources from the Persian royal treasury. You can find the wording of that command in Ezra chapter 7, and it provides one of the most important anchor points in the history of the Bible. And I'll be right back after this to show you how.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Some people wonder why the prophecy of Daniel 9 and verse 25 gets broken up into 2 parts, as in 7 weeks plus 62 weeks, instead of just saying 69 weeks. Well, it's really pretty simple. At the 7-week mark, which would be 49 years, the construction project was done, and it's one more way of letting us know that we're on the right track. The entire prophecy, the 69 weeks, totals 483 prophetic days, or literal years, which takes us to the year AD 27. Now, if you're doing the math at home, you might find that a little confusing because 483 added to 457 should take you to 26 AD instead of 27. But of course, there's no such thing as a year 0. 1 BC was immediately followed by 1 AD, so you've got to account for that when you do the math. That way, 483 takes you to the year 27 AD, which is the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, which is exactly the year that Jesus was baptized and began his public ministry. In other words, Messiah showed up exactly on time. I mean, haven't you always wondered why Jesus just stayed in the background until later in life? Why not start his public ministry earlier? Well, at the age of 30, he would have had a lot more clout, but there's another reason. It just wasn't time yet. In AD 27, the prophecy of Daniel 9 was coming to pass, and it was time for God to announce his Son to the public, which is exactly what he did at Christ's baptism. The Bible tells us that the Holy Spirit descended on Christ that day, and a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." It happened right on time, right according to schedule. This is why so many people find this so compelling and why skeptics tend to skip past Daniel 9, because it's really hard to explain this away. And if this was the only thing that prophecy got right, that'd be worth paying attention to, but it's really just getting warmed up. Here we go on to verse 26, where it says, "And after the 62 weeks Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself." Now, remember, back in the previous verse, it was 7 plus 62 weeks. And what it's telling us is that after that whole period of time is finished, sometime after 27 AD, Messiah was going to be cut off for other people, which is obviously what happened after 3.5 years of public ministry. Jesus was crucified. Then it continues, "And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined." Now, for some strange reason, modern Christians tend to take this verse and stick it way off in the future, in what they assume will be the last few years of this earth's history. But when you see what Jesus said about the abomination of desolation in the book of Daniel, it becomes really, really obvious that this is referring to the sack of the city and the temple by the Romans, when not one stone shall be left here upon another. This really has nothing to do with final events, except maybe in the way that it foreshadows them. What it's telling us is that after Jesus was crucified, somebody was going to come and destroy the city and the temple, the same way the Babylonians did. And of course, that was clearly the Romans who did that in AD 70. And if that's not incredible enough, let's keep pushing on to verse 27. Now, I know this is a lot of nitpicky detail, but this is important because, again today, this is easily one of the most misused, misread passages in all of Scripture. People have been ripping this out of its immediate context and transporting it 2,000 years into the future and making it about Antichrist. But read it very carefully because the language in the context speaks for itself. This is clearly about Messiah the Prince, who would be Jesus. And what it tells us is when we should expect to see his appearance and that he would be cut off for other people sometime after that. But then it continues with what might just be the most breathtaking part of this whole thing. Verse 27. "Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering." Now, this is the part that gets a lot of people confused because what we've done, especially in recent years, is make this about some last day Antichrist. And people say he's going to appear in Jerusalem and make a covenant with the Jews and then break it after 3.5 years. But here's what you need to know. That is not how Christians have historically understood this. Remember, the subject is the second 490 years of probation for Daniel's people, and the subject is the appearance of Messiah. Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years, which is half of 7. It's half of a prophetic week, and what he did with that time was confirm the covenant with God's chosen people. In fact, he ratified the new covenant at the cross, where he certainly brought an end to sacrifice and offering. I mean, the veil in the temple was ripped in two at that very moment. Why? Because the death of Christ suddenly makes all the animal sacrifices completely unnecessary. Then his disciples continued to work in Jerusalem until Stephen the deacon was suddenly martyred in AD 34, 3.5 years after the death of Christ. And at that point, the famous martyr makes one last plea to the religious leadership, after which they put him to death. And who was sitting there? Saul, who later became Paul, the missionary to the Gentiles. The 490 years was over now, right on time. And that's why the prophecy ends the way it does. It says, "And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate." So what's that a reference to? The abomination of desolation, the sack of the temple by the Romans. What we have in Daniel 9 is a literary device known as a parallelism. Verse 26 mentions the work of Messiah and then says the Romans will come and destroy the sanctuary. Then verse 27 repeats that pattern, talking again about the sacrifice of Messiah, after which the Romans would come and leave the temple desolate. This passage has nothing to do with the final 7-year tribulation, even though I suspect there are people right now who are furiously flipping through their Bibles because, well, that's what they've always heard. And if it's there, by all means, have at it. Continue to believe it. But as a good preacher friend of mine once said, if the plain sense makes good sense, seek no other sense or you'll get nonsense. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Well, all I've really managed to do is just crack the seal on Daniel 9, and I'm going to leave it to you to dig a little deeper. But I guess my big point is this. We often overcomplicate the Bible by trying to make it fit what the current culture says. And as a result, we've kind of lost track of one of the most elegant, one of the most convincing passages of the Bible when it comes to demonstrating that Jesus really was the long-awaited Messiah. We've tragically sliced up a perfectly coherent section of the Bible and inserted a gap of 2,000 years, which doesn't make sense. Not when there's nothing in the text to suggest that you should do that. And there's a really big lesson in here for us. The book of Hebrews tells us that we still have a high priest, and that's Christ. He serves in a heavenly sanctuary, so there's still an application for us. And it turns out it's not the buildings that God was most interested in. It was the hearts. It's not the forms and rituals that save you, and just going through the motions doesn't help. The God of the Bible is radically different from the gods of other religions in that He's not looking for ritual. He's looking for you, and that's it. Maybe you've left that part of your life desolate. Your heart is in tatters because of the past, and there's a void where maybe there used to be something. Maybe there's a reason you can't seem to scratch that spiritual itch with mere rituals. So maybe it's time to have another look at this old book, which goes to great lengths to tell you you have another chance with God. I'm Shawn Boonstra. This has been Authentic.